You know how we all have that one friend who's always investigating better ways to help you manage your finances? Well, meet Experian, your trusty BFF. And by that, I mean big financial friend. The Experian app is like having a BFF who's an expert financial profiler, ready to crack the case on your finances and help you take control like a pro. Count on Experian to help prevent your finances from reaching a gruesome outcome. This big financial friend can help you find ways to save, check your FICO score, match you with credit cards, and discover other brilliant solutions to sort out your financial mysteries. Bet your other BFFs can't do all that, And since this big financial friend is right on your phone, it's closer than any accomplice you'll ever have. Just download the Experian app and get started for free. Because honestly, the only mystery you should be solving is knowing where your finances are headed. Results will vary. Credit offers, approvals, and reward programs based on FICO Score 8 model and subject to lender terms. Offers not available in all states. See Experian.com for details.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And actually, it reminds me that the very first time I sat down with Emilee in prison to do our first set of interviews, now I work with college students, and she was a college student. She was that same age. And I remember the thing that struck me or just surprised me at first was just sitting with her. She was exactly like all of my students, in so many ways. Just her normalcy was the thing that sort of surprised me the most at first. And then, of course, it became oh, of course she is. And these myths or these narratives make it seem like risk is cordoned off. And I think it's a real disservice because no one thinks this could happen to them. No one thinks, oh, this could happen to my best friend or my daughter or my niece, because we have this image of this monster.
That's Clara S. Lewis, the author of American Infanticide, a book about the case of college student Emilee Weaver and the tragic ways that infanticide is discussed and dealt with in society. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. There are topics that people don't like to talk about. The inevitability of our own deaths, incest, acts of pedophilia, infanticide. Yet, each of these are real things that impact society, and over the years, some powerful books have explored these topics in powerful ways that have been illuminating and impactful on society. Like Margaret Fergosi's searing 2011 memoir, Tiger, Tiger, about her own childhood sexual abuse by her mother's boyfriend, and Catherine Harrison's memoir, The Kiss, about her incestual relationship with her father. Now Clara Lewis, a senior lecturer at Dartmouth College, tackles one of those taboo topics in American Infanticide, sexism, science, and the politics of sympathy. Clara starts with a 2015 story that begins at Muskingum University's Delta Gamma sorority house in Ohio. She describes the scene of two sorority sisters who found a pool of blood in the first floor bathroom. The women had no idea what happened, but quickly came to suspect that their sorority sister, Emilee Weaver, someone Clara describes as studious, athletic, and well-liked. They had noticed that Emilee started wearing large sweaters and hiding her midsection. They suspected that she might be pregnant. Soon, in the driveway, they found the harrowing sight of a newborn girl dead inside a garbage bag. The crime made national headlines and seemed senseless, but looking even slightly below the surface, it was obvious that the story was much more about denial, our human nature to repress and suppress our thoughts and memories. It's a coping mechanism that can be quite healthy and self-protective, allowing us to maintain positive thinking and compartmentalize stress that can throw us off track. But in its extremes, it can have powerful negative impact. Clara takes us even deeper in her book, exploring the role that sexism, science, law, history, and what she calls the politics of sympathy play a role in things like infanticide, including our propensity to characterize the women who commit this act as, quote, mom monsters, and the lost children as, quote, dumpster babies. She explores the events since colonial times and uses Emilee's case, which is told as well as any true crime story, to illustrate some of the bias and inconsistency around those perceptions. Her clarion call is to change the way that we, as a society, respond to these incidents, the need to lift stigma about pregnancy, and to prepare people for the realities of pregnancy and motherhood so they don't feel they need to utilize denial. Clara's previous book, Tough on Hate, The Cultural Politics of Hate Crimes, explores the cases of people like Matthew Shepard, the gay teenager who was killed in Laramie, Wyoming, and James Byrd Jr., the black man who was dragged by chains behind a truck in Texas. She re-examines the notion of hate crimes in that book. This book, she re-examines the way that we look at infanticide. Today, we're going to explore Clara's interest in the topic, Emilee's case, and what we can learn to help others combat this problem. So, Clara, I just wanted to thank you for coming on to the podcast. I'm actually excited about having this conversation because I think it's an important topic that fits in the bucket of things that we don't talk about enough. And, Brian Santana, who was previously a guest on the podcast where we talked with him and his brother Cameron about their book, Murder on Campus, told me at first that you were a person I definitely needed to meet. And then it dawned on him that it would be really cool with your book coming out for me to give it a read and also have a conversation with you about it. And after reading it, I took away a lot. I took away a lot about sort of some of the nuance and some of the complications and some of the things that we don't talk about. But I was also really, 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 really impressed by the fact that the narrative in the book, while you included all of this deep thinking and these deep ideas, the narrative in the book was as good as any true crime story I've ever read in my life. And, but it had that nuance and it had that depth at looking at some of the root causes and the underlying issues. So I appreciate the fact that you've written the book and that we can have this conversation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that and your listeners and Brian's introduction. Yeah, he's the absolute best.
Yeah, he truly is a very cool guy. I'm glad to have him on my sort of roster of friends now. I don't know if he would call us friends, but I certainly call him one. So
yes, definitely.
And I wanted to just sort of start by stepping back a little bit about you and sort of like your background and how you got into this. I had noticed that your previous book had focused on hate crimes. And you looked at in that book a number of different hate crimes like Matthew Shepard, the gay man at the University of Wyoming who was, murdered by two men. And that was in Laramie, Wyoming. And we've talked about that on the show before. But another one that we haven't talked about on the show was the murder of James Byrd Jr. And I remember, I was much younger at that time, hearing the stories of him being chained up and dragged on the back of a truck and being murdered. And just, I remember the thought that went through my head at that time as it emerged that it was a hate crime that, like, I cannot believe this is happening in America today, like in my grandfather's age or my great-grandfather's age, maybe. And it really took me back. So I was curious about what sort of inspired you to write about hate crimes and now writing about infanticide.
Yeah, thank you for doing that in-depth legwork and connecting it to the previous work. I think that I'm very interested in projects where there's like a disconnect between the media representation and then the research literature. So you have these really intense, sensational cases that are so horrifying and appalling in both topics. And then if you kind of get deeper into the weeds in terms of the scholarship that's available, you start to see this really significant disconnect there. And I'm always interested in that space between public representation, and then what we can sort of what we can learn about if we go deeper, have a different kind of curiosity about the subject. And then when it came to looking at infanticide, I quickly began to realize that the research literature itself, while there's some really strong work in forensic psychiatry and law, the research literature itself was really limited. Brian and I come out of the same grad program, so we're trained to look for places where we can make a useful contribution with our more interdisciplinary training, and that felt like, okay, there's lots to bring forward there.
That's an interesting point, and something I hadn't really thought about it. And we're of like minds there. I tend to have a reaction before we were recording. I told you that I remember being in New York on 9/11 and covering the attacks. And I remember the moment where I was at Ground Zero on the first day, and the thought crossed my mind. Like, I asked myself, why would 19 people choose to commit suicide this way? And that there's got to be some deeper sociological, economic reasons. It's not that they're all crazy. It's not that they're all evil. And there may be crazy people in the bunch. There may be evil people, but there's some complicated issues underneath it that we don't want to talk about. And I remember like several weeks later, the New Yorker did this great story. It may have been David Remnick on Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al Qaeda, and the way that he grew up and what he was exposed to and how he became part of the Islamic Jihad and what those people went through. And it sort of clicked in my head. Oh, here are some of the underlying sociological, economic issues. Here, and why I think that's important, why I think thinking about that's important. Taking 9/11 as an example, we can shoot all the missiles over the fence. We can send all the troops. We can drop all the bombs from B-2 Spirits that we want. But if we don't change the way that people perceive us or address the underlying root causes, I guess, we never actually solve problems. Like a missile is a Band-Aid, right? In that example. But if we can solve the underlying problems, then we can really solve things. And I thought of that exact same thing as I was reading your book. And then I was also researching on infanticide and even Emilee's case. Like, nobody's really looking at the root causes. So it's interesting you say that you found literature in forensic psychiatry. You found things in the law, but you didn't find things in other areas. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
I think, no, I think a lot about that. I think in some ways, it's almost like a lack of curiosity about women's experiences and certain things just sort of being taken for granted in these kinds of cases. I think what stood out to me so much looking at the historical literature was just, there's these certain boxes that women get put in when they're accused of these crimes or convicted of these crimes. And the boxes are so narrow, thinking like you're either a monster or a victim or a madwoman. And you see the same way of talking about these cases going back to the colonial era. Like before we even have the founding of the country, you see women being put into these different boxes and this language of sort of being like lewd and cunning versus being innocent and seduced. And that same narrative and framing has just continued forward. And if you like the coverage that you were looking at has those same kinds of restrictive boxes. And so I don't know if that sort of got in the way of other kinds of research interests. It's just, and I think it's like if it's neglected in one way, it's hard to pick up on any threads. Like there has to be sort of an ongoing conversation that's happening. And
it's interesting you say that, because what you made me think there, which I hadn't really thought about, is that if we have a complicated issue like this that is depicted and discussed the same way for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's a red flag because we know science has advanced and our understanding of people has advanced. But if our conversation about topics hasn't advanced, that should be a warning sign, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like one of the early sources that I read that really made me interested in doing more work on this area is a book about homicide in Chicago in the 1800s by Jeffrey Adler. And he just has one chapter about infanticide. And it just described basically how prevalent these kinds of crimes and also just tragic infant deaths were at that time period, to the point where it was sort of commonplace for Chicagoans to just encounter the corpses of dead infants. And I remember being stunned and taken aback by that description. And I had already finished a graduate degree in American history at that point, and I had, TA'd for classes on women's history, and it just didn't come up anywhere within that conversation. And part of me thinks that there's a way in which it's been erased from the American narrative
Mm.
over time, and that you see a lot more robust research in other countries, in European countries, that have done like much more systematic historical work. But there's something about, like what American mothers are responsible for and how that relates to forming the nation. And so it just felt in a way that it had been marginalized or just under-considered.
Is there something about sort of like the American way of thinking that you think might contribute to it maybe being harder to have these kinds of conversations? Like you were saying, it shows up a little bit in the European literature, but not in American conversations? Because I also wonder about that sometimes when I think of things like American exceptionalism. Like we have a deep desire to view ourselves as Americans in a very positive light. Like for, if we had it our way over our 250-year history, there would be no mistakes. We want to sort of like ignore things like slavery or genocide against Native Americans. But we have this tendency, unlike what you might see in European countries with very long and mixed histories, of having a hard time accepting some uglier things that happen within our society. I was curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a factor here. In some ways, that same sort of tendency really sort of delayed even like earlier historical research on infanticide in the West. There were certain assumptions, like demographic historians developed all these techniques to study things like femicide in more Eastern countries, but they didn't actually start applying those same techniques to Western countries and societies until really recently. Like you're just seeing some important work coming out in that area. Um, so yeah, I think it was just sort of assumed that that Westerners behave differently, and that's just a stereotyped kind of assumption there.
And since we don't have conversations about this, how do you as somebody who's looking at these cases, you mentioned femicide, which is the female version of infanticide. What are sort of like the key terms or ideas to even understand? And I only say that because I was just thinking as you were talking, like we don't talk about this, so people may not even be informed about that space.
Oh gosh, yeah, I'll definitely get into some of the just key definitions. And I was just reflecting back briefly about where you started off thinking about the pilots at 9/11 and like your questions about why
Hmm.
related to them. And it strikes me that there is this through line here, which is that there's like this moral satisfaction in being able to single out the culpable individual and feel that they're recognizable and distinct from the rest of us, and like that they deserve this kind of harsh punishment. Um,
Mm.
you're
Yeah.
willing to step back and like ask those why questions that just sort of came to you naturally in the moment. You begin to see those concentric circles of shared culpability, and you sort of lose the ability to have that sort of clean, punitive kind of retributive sentiment.
That's actually a really good point because it's the discomfort that comes with it. And that's a really interesting point because I think there's a second reason too that people do that, and it's a defense against ourselves. Like the same reason why, if you notice, people will follow big criminal justice cases where there's a victim, and they'll start to convince themselves of how they're different than the victim, so it won't happen to them, or how they're different than the perpetrator, the guy who kills his wife or whatever, so they can convince themselves that it's not like them. So I do think there's that element. And then there's that element that you're talking about moral responsibility. That's another thing, right? Because we don't want to, as a society, be responsible for that guy being homeless or that person being poor, because then the guilt lands on us, or in part on us, and it's a lot easier. So, and I look at all those things as we're just pushing it away from ourselves, that I'm not going to be responsible, that I'm not going to do this bad thing, that this bad thing is not going to happen to me. And it's almost like this compartmentalization and this denial that we're in, which is kind of an interesting way to think about it for me. But the cost of that cost of pushing it away, just like the 9/11 example, is that we never really solve the problem. And we're leaving people to, one, not be informed about this, and two, to sort of like more easily repeat this cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And actually, it reminds me that, the very first time I sat down with Emily in prison to do our like first set of interviews, now I work with college students, and she was a college student. She was that same age. And I remember the thing that like struck me or just surprised me at first was just sitting with her. She was exactly like all of my students, in so many ways. Just her normalcy was the thing that sort of surprised me the most at first. And then, of course, it became like, oh, of course she is. And these myths or these narratives make it seem like risk is cordoned off. And I think it's a real disservice, because no one thinks this could happen to them. No one thinks, oh, this could happen to my best friend or my daughter or my niece, because we have this image of this monster. And that really gets in the way of having an awareness of how widespread this risk really is.
Right. Yeah. My daughter, my cousin, my niece is not a monster. This person is a monster, so that will never happen to them. And that reminds me of something that I learned, and it took a minute. When I was a reporter, on occasion, I would go to a prison and interview somebody who was a murderer, or I'd meet people who are murderers, or I'd meet people who are on trial for it, right? And I tell people I have never met a murderer that I didn't like. And I don't think that's anything unique about me. But when you're actually sitting and having a conversation with a lot of them, and I have not interviewed any serial killers or, true sadists, I would say, or people like that. But when you're sitting in front of them as a real human being, hearing their real story, whether you believe all of it or not, it crystallizes, getting that close, that you see the commonalities, that we're all humans, and that anyone is capable, and people hate it when I say this, or some people do, anyone is capable of anything under the right circumstances and the right pressure. And it may be an ugly thing to think about, but I actually think it's sort of key, because when I go to talk to college students, I'll often talk about this, because accepting that anyone is capable of anything is an excellent way to guard against it sneaking up inside you.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. So I should ask you actually about Emilee's case itself and her life. One of the things that really struck me when I was reading the book, the description of her by other people: athletic, studious, people liked her. she was sort of like, I could imagine her as any sort of like promising college student, or, she had a group of friends. She was connected and doing well with her sorority. She had all these things. And that really struck me, excuse me, really struck me. Um, so I'm just curious about why you decided to tell her story, what you found out during her story, and what you can tell us about who Emily is and what happened.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, at first I was looking for a case study for the book to go more in depth because previous research by an amazing law professor, Michelle Oberman, had kind of arrived at the conclusion that these cases are socially and culturally situated. But you have to really go in depth on a single case to explore what that means. And so in a way, I'm picking up on that thread and sort of extending that discussion with Emily's case. So I was reading a lot of trial transcripts and doing pretty systematic news media analysis. And so I was reading the transcript for Emily's trial, and it read like a Shakespearean tragedy to me. It felt like Othello. Like there were just so many things. You just see it ticking down and down. So it had this like incredible emotional dynamic to it. And then at that point in time, Emily had already been convicted for aggravated murder, and she'd been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole originally when I started working on her case. And that just struck me as so disproportionate. When I think about that element of like tragic timing, so close to the end of the school year. If Emily had made it home for the summer and had gone into labor at home, there could have been a really different outcome. Like her mom could have taken her to the emergency room. Um, even if the tragedy had happened, likely there would have been other elements there to sort of protect her in a sense. But because of the timing and because of what happened, um, she ends up talking to police right after she's had the delivery, like before she's even received any medical care. It's the middle of the night. She's been up laboring, and then she's alone being interrogated until like 3 or 4 in the morning before she's received any medical care for the medical injuries she sustained during the labor. And then she ends up with this incredibly disproportionate sentence and this aggravated murder conviction. And so I just thought that mismatch there. I think Emily's case would be the kind of uh, neonaticide that would normally attract a certain amount of sympathy. That if like the first people who had engaged with her were medical professionals, that there would have been a different legal outcome. There's a lot of cases like this that just receive kind of like a quiet kind of leniency and don't become highly sensationalized and reported on in the same way. But those sensational details of the sorority house and all of that made it such a headline. Um,
Mm.
so that I just felt her sentence was so disproportionate. It was so it failed to just understand her circumstances, and that made me feel that it was worthy of greater public scrutiny. And Emily was generous in terms of wanting to share her story and wanting to help do more public advocacy and raise awareness too. So there's a reciprocal element of that.
That's an interesting piece of it that I hadn't really thought of before, that, the narrative, having a powerful narrative, the story of what happened, the sorority sisters finding the blood in the bathroom, them going out and searching, all of those things kind of in a heart, in a, while true, but in a harmful way, to your point about Shakespearean tragedies, there are lots of key elements to it, but one of the key elements is this good versus evil piece, right? And, that this idea of this tragic ending came about because of good versus evil. But when I think about Emily's life and the way that you described it and what happened, it really didn't seem as black and white.
Yeah, I certainly don't think so.
What stuck out to you about her background? You mentioned that she seemed like any other college student. Was there anything that sort of stuck out to you about her background that you think either contributed to this or surprised you?
I think that there's definitely elements, there's intergenerational elements to a lot of these kinds of tragedies. And Emilee's case, certainly you can see that there too. Um, there's this element of like unperceived pregnancy, and new research is showing that there are certain like genetic components to that. So, I mean, one, unperceived pregnancy is just more common than most people realize. Like 1 in 3 to 500 pregnancies actually does go unrecognized all the way up until the start of the third trimester. And Emilee's mom had experienced an unperceived pregnancy while she was a senior in high school, and that's Emilee's oldest sibling. And that went all the way through to labor and delivery. So there's a certain like genetic and intergenerational component. And then there's also like that intergenerational kinds of trauma and family abuse that are in the mix. And I think that's certainly true in Emilee's story. And that's certainly something her mother has really spoken up about and tried to really take, responsibility in a sense for that happening. I think one of the things that's sort of amazing about Emilee's case is that, she and her mom have gotten so much closer after this tragedy and have had these really hard conversations that they didn't have. So, I think Emilee did feel that, her mom is in a difficult and abusive relationship, and how can you burden a parent who's in that situation further? I think that is certainly a component here too, that Emilee was always, she was never someone who needed help. She was never someone who was in any kind of trouble, who ever wanted to be a burden to other people. And so I think that she had this very private part to herself that she was, protecting.
Yeah, one of the things you had mentioned earlier, that idea of unperceived pregnancy, and it's a lot more common than people recognize. And I didn't really think about it that much, and I had thought about it always in the context of it being a person who's in denial. Until I started working in clinical mental health environments, and it wasn't my client, but it was a colleague's client who was like 12 or 13 years old, pregnant
Mhm.
by, unfortunately, her mother's boyfriend,
Yeah.
and um, didn't know until after 30 weeks. And so my initial reaction to that was, well, she clearly had to be in denial. So I started looking up some of the literature on it because, my natural curiosity. And I saw this concept that people used, cryptic pregnancy. And I saw that they researched it under that, but they were kind of like lumping together what I would say were at least 3 different things. And it was really fascinating to me that they were lumping them together, almost as if they were somehow the same thing, where we didn't know what they were. But the idea we're talking about unperceived pregnancy, then they were also lumping in the concept of denial, and then this concept of sort of like a stealth pregnancy. And I remember thinking at the time, like, if we're researching these things, like maybe they're subsets of each other, but maybe we're researching they're different things, or they're things that can happen at the same time. Could you talk a little bit more about that idea of an unperceived pregnancy and what we're really dealing with there?
Yeah. And I agree that the categories are just way too broad. And there's actually a lot more research in this area to be done. And I think this is one of the things that's absolutely the hardest for people to understand, and especially women who've experienced pregnancy. I mean, I would say for myself, I have 2 babies. I've been pregnant twice, and felt hyper aware of all of the physical sensations almost from the very outset. Just this feeling, you just feel it's such an intense sensory experience for most women. And you're just following along and noticing these signs and symptoms and reading books that notice the same signs and symptoms. And so it's almost impossible to believe that someone could be going through all of that and not be aware and not recognize it accurately. And I think in doing this research, it sort of humbled me to the sense that, okay, just because this was my pregnancy experience doesn't mean it's everybody else's, and that women do not all experience pregnancy in the exact same way. And that actually pregnancy recognition itself is like a much more complex process than most people realize or sort of give credit. Even in the situation where a woman is trying to get pregnant and is really wanting to have that baby, it's still not just like you flip a switch and you go from not pregnant to pregnant. Like, it's not like an easy yes or no. There's like, oh, okay, maybe I'm missing a period. Maybe I'll take a home test. Then maybe I'll make an appointment with a doctor and get further confirmation. And then, pregnancy recognition also comes with pregnancy preparation and taking certain kinds of actions. So when are you going to choose to tell your inner circle versus maybe more distant friends or relatives?
Hmm.
All of that. So one, I think it's just so important to just recognize that pregnancy recognition itself is much more complex and multifaceted than people realize.
And probably the more knowledge you have about pregnancy, the easier it is, which I think probably for a woman who's a little bit older or an older adult may not be as much of an issue. But particularly if you're younger and you don't have people around you who have gone through similar experiences, I imagine some of the signs might be harder to detect. And something you said just reminded me of something that I think is super important to think about in this context, and frankly, any context, is we love as humans to use empirical evidence from our own lives as everyone's truth.
Yes. Yeah. This is definitely the case here. Absolutely. And there's a debate happening right now among researchers, and a really important, just beloved friend and mentor of mine, Dr. Diana Barnes, argues, in favor of sort of recognizing unperceived pregnancy as a dissociative disorder, having this recognized by American psychiatrists, including it in the diagnostic manuals. And I really support that project on her end. And I think that the language or the rhetoric of unperceived is important and useful and is really accurate in describing, someone like Emilee's experience. But I also think there's a valuable conversation to have about denial. Denial is not a choice. We don't choose the secrets we're going to keep from ourselves. That it is a coping mechanism that's there for these unbearable realities.
And a healthy one at times, a very healthy one at times. When you think of something like a dissociative disorder, which is just basically a mental health disorder where somebody's, feelings or thoughts or memories become disconnected. Like the extreme version of it is, in popular imagination, it's that idea of multiple personality disorder where you have compartments. But the vast majority of people who have dissociative disorders don't have multiple compartments. But all of us, they don't have multiple personalities, but all of us have multiple compartments that we put in things. And like the example that always comes to mind to me is I'm driving to work. I see a horrible car wreck and I drive by, I have an emotional reaction. And then 2 minutes later, I'm like perfectly fine. Well, my mind is just simply compartmentalizing this horrible thing that I just watched so I can go on with my day and I can function effectively. Because if I chose to live in that moment all day, it would, destroy my day or destroy my week or whatever it is. So we all compartmentalize, and really all dissociation is this extreme version of it. Is that fair to say? In a response to trauma, usually.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is very fair to say. And again, I think it's like these cases aren't all the same, and that space between something that's like a really tragic accident versus kind of where prevention is possible often just has to do with whether or not the young woman makes it to an emergency department at the time of labor. And then also that space of like the difference between beginning to have some intellectual awareness of something versus having like the appropriate emotional reaction to that awareness.
Yep.
I think you can see that sometimes in these cases where it sort of begins to sort of switch between unperceived to some element of denial, where there's like, okay, I'm beginning to have some intellectual here late in the third trimester. but it's not coming with that same like emotional awareness to be like, oh my gosh, I need to seek help immediately. I'm unsafe. Something really terrible could happen. And, so maybe that connects back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of just the stigma associated with these cases and that sense of like, well, I couldn't, this isn't something that could happen to me. This isn't happening in my life.
Yeah, it made me think of something as you were just talking. Obviously, things like unperceived pregnancy don't explain all infanticide.
Yeah.
Do we have any ideas or numbers or research about sort of like what percentage of infanticide includes some element of, for lack of better words, some element of disassociation or just not realizing that you're pregnant?
Yeah. I mean, actually, this gets into this bigger conversation in some ways about the sort of distorted nature of the media representation, which is that like Emilee's cases like Emilee's and these tragic neonaticides get a lot of media reporting, but the majority of infant homicides kind of don't. And this gets back to that sort of technical definitions that we were sort of getting into earlier, which is that, neonaticides are infant homicides or these tragic, that look a lot more like tragic accidents that occur immediately at birth, like within the first 24 hours, but usually more like the first 3 minutes of the baby's life. And these account for a really small fraction of overall infant homicides in the US. Something like a third of infant homicides occur in that postpartum period. The ones that happen after 24 hours are much more associated with postpartum mental health distress.
Mm.
Women who are experiencing that level of distress often have both like suicidal and homicidal ideation, and they're much more likely to seek help because it's terrifying. So those are more susceptible to prevention than the neonaticide cases. And then
Mm.
there's 70% of infant homicides in the US are committed by male partners, and they occur during episodes of physical abuse against the baby. And those cases are also more susceptible to prevention because the homicide doesn't usually occur in the first instance of severe physical abuse. So this will be, a family that will be in the hospital or in the emergency department for previous abuse-related episodes. The babies in these cases get brought to the hospital because they weren't trying to kill the baby. So there's room for intervention there too, and those are really the majority of these kinds of cases. But part of me feels that they're too sad to be sort of newsworthy. You can't really sensationalize these abuse-related deaths
Hmm.
in the same way.
Yeah, no, it makes sense because I can think of only two cases, Emilee's case, that really stuck in my head. And then I'm sure you're familiar with it. You may not be, but the case, and I remember this when I was growing up, because let's see, in 1996, I would have been 2 years out of high school. And um, in 1996, there was the case of Amy Grossberg and Brian Peterson, and I think it was in New Jersey. And what had happened was, and I think it was at a hotel or a motel, Amy gave birth um, to a baby, or no, it wasn't New Jersey, it was in Delaware. And she gave birth to a baby, and then Brian threw the baby in the dumpster. I think Brian pled guilty to something like manslaughter. And then I think Amy also pled guilty, but I'm not sure what she pled guilty to. But both these stories, out of all of the stories I've heard, have caught the most attention. In Amy's case, she said something very, very similar that she didn't realize until toward the end that she was pregnant. But one of the things that I know from that case, one of the biggest things and biggest questions, people just didn't believe that that was possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's, the challenge here, I think that you're kind of getting at is some of the media portrayals work against addressing some of these issues. Because I think of the thing that you said about postpartum. we don't talk about that enough. Some of the depression people can feel, even mania, even psychosis sometimes. And, I think about my life and I think about the number of women I know who have experienced it. Um, and, I come from a mental health background, so people probably feel more comfortable talking to me about things like this. I think of the number of women who experience it versus the number of women who I talk to who have been pregnant, dealt with issues, and who say to me they never had a conversation where somebody explained to them that this could happen. Or a doctor mentioned something, but it wasn't, really discussed in detail. Hey, look out for these signs or these things. Do you think there could be a benefit to having more broad conversations about these things so people can be prepared in that moment or something
Yeah.
along those lines?
Yeah, I really do. And um yeah, being able to have these conversations in a way that extends a lot more compassion and empathy. I think a lot of this is just about like how hard it is to be socially recognized as a good mother and how important that is for someone's
Mm,
feeling that they can claim that status and then
you have to be the happy mother. Like, why aren't you happy? You have a baby, right? Like, you're not allowed to be sad at that moment.
yeah, that the ideals and the expectations feel so restrictive in a sense to not sort of make room for something like that.
Yeah, because I just think that in general, because people view pregnancy as a positive thing, many women don't really talk about the emotional, difficult ones or the struggles that they have afterwards. And, even for people who are either hiding their pregnancies or don't even know they're, they're pregnant, we never really discuss those aspects of it. And it reminds me a lot about um, the progress we've made in mental health. I always love to tell the story about how when I first went in for substance abuse treatment, they had this form. Do you have a family history of diabetes? Do you have a family history of X cancer? Do you have a family history of drug abuse? Do you have a family history of, you know, different mental health disorders? And I literally checked, like, outside of diabetes, no, 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 right, to all of them. So then when I went through treatment and then eventually I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I turn around and find out like half my mother's side of the family has been diagnosed with some kind of mental illness. And they only started talking about it once they knew I had it, or I happened to look in their medicine cabinet and be like, wait a second, that drug's for X. So it was really, it's really, I feel like stigma gets in the way of going back to what we were talking about. Anyone's capable of anything. I think that it and accepting that anyone is capable of anything helps you guard against things. I think knowing about mental illness, people talking about mental illness helps people get help faster because they know the signs. They can see the precursors because someone's talked to them about them. I'm wondering whether like this is kind of like a conversation that all young women should hear about.
And I think having a more widespread awareness of unperceived pregnancy and understanding that this isn't monstrous or something that people choose for themselves could be helpful. I look at, the situation going on in the sorority house where there's a sense of gossip and a sense of awareness. And there are even these attempts to try to sort of like ask, like, hey, are you pregnant? And so these moments where friends were sort of coming forward and having questions and then backing off. But I think that's sort of like, that would be sort of like asking a friend or a relative something like, do you think you're in an abusive relationship? Or do you think you have an addiction problem? Do you think you have an eating disorder? And then sort of letting them say no and moving on. I
Yep.
think that in some ways it speaks to just the difficulty of intervention and how sort of impolite it is. And also like how loved you have to be for people to do that for you because you just have to violate so many norms of politeness to sort of go beyond just asking the question and backing off. I think if I had a young woman in my life who I was concerned about now, one, it would just be so hard to raise and it would be so impolite, right, to observe that weight gain and say something. But if you had that much concern, I think you'd have to sort of follow up and be like, hey, this can happen and you might not even know it's happening. What if we just take a pregnancy test together and I'll hold your hand the whole time? And if it comes back positive, I'm going to be the first person to just congratulate you and throw that baby shower for you or help you figure out what kind of adoption would work best. Like, you still have good options no matter how close to the actual due date we really are.
Mm.
You would take that level of conversation in these cases. Um, but again, I think that other
You're,
kinds of infant homicide are more preventable.
you're kind of honing in actually on a really good point, like a meta point about life, which I think is like love should not be confused with being nice, because you can be nice and you can be loving. But sometimes the loving thing to do is to tell people things that they don't want to hear, to step on that. Like, I love the way that you articulated it there because it's a much better way than I would have. But that notion of, yeah, I can ask someone, hey, are you pregnant? Or I could say, hey, I'm really wondering whether you're pregnant, and maybe you should take a pregnancy test. And like you said, holding their hands, that's almost, it takes more love and strength to step on the taboo. And that if you really love someone and you really care about someone, it's something you should consider. You mentioned the sorority sisters
Mm.
too. And that was one of the things that really stuck out to me about Emilee's case was how quickly those sisters went to the idea in their heads when they found the blood in the bathroom that Emilee was pregnant. And then immediately they started searching, and it stuck, and they found the baby in the driveway beside I think it was beside the kitchen. And it really stuck out in my mind that they so quickly went to that. They saw blood on the floor in the bathroom, and they so quickly went. They didn't go to like, there's an axe murderer in the house or something like that, or is someone somehow harmed. And the fact that they so quickly went to that made me think that they instinctually knew that this was a possibility. And it makes me wonder whether, like, in the back of women's minds, like, this is quietly something that they know is possible, but it's still not something that we talk about. What did you think about their reaction?
Oh, goodness. I think that's a very, like, astute observation on your part, and I've puzzled over that behavior so much. And I think, like, the asterisks or the important footnote to the point I was making before about how you could have this conversation in a way that was stepping on those tacks like you described, but still compassionate. Like, the asterisk there is that, I certainly wouldn't be in favor of any kinds of policies or social practices that would lead to, like, increased surveillance over women who might be pregnant, or younger women who might be pregnant. Like, they still retain the same privacy rights as everyone else. And I certainly wouldn't want to, like, encourage this increased surveillance in any way, or support anything like that. And I think what happens is that, there's a certain sort of gossip mechanism that's going on. Some of that's trying to be self-protective or trying to sort of keep a sense of what the communal norms are. But I think there had just been so much conversation going on in that manner. And that just further kind of isolated Emilee. There was like another pregnant woman on campus at the same time. And Emilee was just listening to everyone talk about her body for that whole year and just comparing herself and being like, well, that's not me. I'm not standing out in that way.
Mm.
I don't have to face that stigma. And so in a way, it almost reinforced the lack of perception or the denial in that sense. And I think just the crime scene itself, I would describe Emilee's case really as a tragic accident. Like, I reject viewing it as a crime for a number of different reasons. To my mind, if you look carefully enough, it's a horribly tragic accident. And Emilee's owned a lot more culpability than that in so many ways.
Tell me why. Why do you see it that way?
Well, I think that whatever's going on before labor starts, once someone's alone, who's never given birth before and is doing so alone, like that, it's pretty typical of these cases to assume it's some other gastrointestinal disease or issue, and to sort of find yourself on a toilet or in a bathroom, as was true here. And we know that labor is kind of a sneak attack, right? It's like you can have hours of sort of early labor where things are kind of okay, and then heavy labor sets in and it gets really, really different and
Right.
intense. And at that point, the medical injuries are so severe. In trying to deliver a baby alone, you can imagine doing this in like terrified silence, feeling like the most alone person in the world. And then
Right. Because that's one thing too, you know, I think giving birth itself, you have to think of it as a physical trauma in
yes.
some levels. I mean, and by using the word trauma, I don't mean bad thing, but your body is literally being traumatized.
It's the most extreme thing the human body does naturally. And the vast majority of American women will have a lot of medical intervention and support to get through this alive. And it's just an incredibly dangerous situation for both mother and baby to be alone in this way.
Mm.
And I think that, the medical injuries create a dissociative state in their aftermath. And this is something that Dr. Barnes really speaks beautifully to. It's that when you're in that dissociative state, that dreamlike state, you're precluded from forming some kind of rational motivation. And I think that plays out when you look at like what was like, why leave the bathroom in that state? And then also why leave the baby, in the garbage bag just next to the house? You can just sort of see the disheveled mentality that's in play there. Like this would have been if this was an intentional malicious crime,
Mm.
it would have been easy for Emilee to get away with it with just a few more things in terms of like,
Right, because no one knew she was pregnant, right? You could have put the baby into the trash can or the dumpster or a trash bag, and she really didn't show a lot of those consciousness of guilt elements. One of the things I was thinking as I was reading, and you're sort of revealing this idea that she didn't know she was pregnant, I was thinking like, what would be an analogous thing as a man? And I realized it would be waking up one morning and realizing that I was pregnant, period. Be like this thing that I think totally could not have happened. And I was like thinking about what kind of thoughts would go through my mind at that moment. And I was like, okay, I get it. Like I would lose it. I I would there would be stars, my head would be spinning. I would be so confused, but then thinking that the idea of physical birth, I could get how it could throw someone who's alone, who's not expecting it, so far off.
yes, exactly. It's sort of this like sneak attack in a way, in these cases. And then you're in a state of just being panicked and in shock and injured. Um, and yeah, this is sort of a pivot, but it kind of gets back to that conversation. Like, what would you want younger women to know? And I think there's also something to like want young men to know as partners. Maybe they're going to be the only person that a girl confides in, and she's doing so in a really tentative fashion. And I think that male partners could, in those moments, really step up and offer a different level of support, and to understand that they too are sort of in a way involved in the risk here and the potential harm.
Mm. What kinds of things do you think men in those situations could do? Like some practical advice for what you could do.
And I think just being supportive in a sense and assuring that there's going to be resources and that you're not going to just disappear or leave your partner on their own.
Mm.
Kind of that you're in it with them, whatever the consequences are going to be. That's so important. And it's like you never see male partners like included in the news media reporting on these cases. You never see male partners being forced to testify at these trials, even when, these are rape inseminations or incest cases like you're describing. It's like the spotlight is so narrowly on that one individual mother. And I just think expanding that and sort of including that in the conversation in that circle of shared culpability.
Yeah, that we're in it. Like, it's so helpful in life when you're going through anything difficult to know that there's another person who's in it with you. And also, it's so helpful, I think, in life. I was thinking of a friend recently who's dealing with some health issues, and like that the healthcare system is completely failing her, like our societal safety net and the healthcare system. And I said something along the lines of, she was having a moment where she was just feeling having a very hard time. And she made a comment about like, I should have gone to college for X, or I should have done this. My dad was right, kind of thing. And I was like, I really wish that we lived in a country where we collectively, had done a better job with healthcare. I wish I was telling her, I wish I had done my part to, like, because I'm a universal healthcare fan, to fight for universal healthcare and other things like that. And she was really shocked that I was taking responsibility for her position. And I think in the example that we're talking about with men who are responsible for a pregnancy, I didn't even really think like taking responsibility is so important. And then also in a society where we are also responsible, I think it's really important that collectively as a society, we don't look at these women just as sort of like cookie cutter villains, and we accept that like we're responsible for a system that somehow has led to this person being alone in this moment. Like that's a problem for all of us to solve, right? Like we're not heroes by vilifying these women. We're really heroes when we work to solve the broader root cause problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I'm so sorry your friend is going through that. And it brings up a sort of an other issue. It's like, I think a lot of the time when these cases get talked about, there's sort of this assumed like zero sum game. Like either you're, you know, empathetic towards the victim, the baby, and that then leads to wanting retribution or harsh punishment against the mom. And I think there's a lot that's sort of missing there. I mean, one that mothers who experience these kinds of tragedies grieve the loss so intensely and experience so much remorse. And this is just a lifetime of grief. It changes a life course in so many ways. And so just to acknowledge that the family and the grandparents, these babies are buried, their grave sites are tended to, and there's just such an intense sense of loss and grief for the entire family and for the mother as well. And that for people who identify with the baby victim and want safety there, I mean, one, I really resonate with that. And so much of this work is about that aspect and like what role can we all play in facilitating these safer outcomes. And I think that the caveat is that, neonaticides, this very particular and very kind of rare form of infant homicide, is very difficult to prevent. And in a sense, I think my work calls for a higher degree of compassion to moms who do go through these kinds of really tragic ordeals. But if we're looking at the healthcare system, as a country, we have an incredibly high rate of infant mortality. And these are really preventable infant deaths and babies that are like deeply wanted and beloved, that get lost in the first days and weeks of life needlessly. And a lot of that boils down to what you were just discussing, which is that like all of the unequal access to healthcare and lack of access to prenatal care, and then the care immediately postpartum. And so, for folks who really are fast or sort of eager to save babies, I think that would be where I would put the resources and policies first and really direct kind of energy there.
Would you have any advice for, law enforcement, prosecutors, and others who come across these kinds of cases?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see law in this area be applied a lot more consistently, so you don't see this sort of huge variety in terms of the kinds of charges that are being brought forward. And I would also like to see a more humane policing practice here. I've watched a lot of different interrogations and they've occurred at different timeframes. And, I think that there's a lot of willingness to accept culpability in these cases because there is so much remorse and grief that accompanies it. And so police don't necessarily have to force the interrogation immediately after the childbirth. I think it's really important that, women and girls have access to this kind of medical care first, and also access to grief counseling, and then to come in and give these confessions, because they're willing to give the confession, but doing it under a state of duress where someone is still in shock, um, that doesn't seem humane to me.
Yeah, and we do similar things, I think, or law enforcement does similar things when somebody's suicidal. They'll often allow them to go off to the psychiatric hospital for a little while and then interview them afterwards or arrest them afterwards. But that's something, I wonder as you say that, I wonder whether that is something that is influenced by the fact that pregnancy doesn't happen to men. Do you know what I mean? Like a man can see, suicidal, okay, that's relatable, but they can't think of how traumatizing birth is and how like taking a beat may really help the person and the process and getting closer to the truth. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think that's an interesting observation. I hadn't thought about it in that way before, that like if men experience this particular kind of injury and physical trauma, would the response be different? Um, yeah, maybe.
You had mentioned when we were talking before we started recording that a lot of Emilee's story didn't really come to light until her she post-trial, post-conviction, she received a public defender for her appeals. Is that right? And that's when a lot of her narrative and her story um, was sort of first told. Is that right?
Yeah, Emily has really just a heroic attorney now, named Rachel Troutman. When she took on Emily's case, she was doing death penalty cases for the state of Ohio, and working for their death penalty division. And because Emily's sentence was life without parole, Emily became her client in that way. And she's just absolutely been heroic on Emily's behalf, and getting Emily to the resentencing hearing was so important.
Well, what do you hope for Emilee?
Oh my goodness. I was thinking, she came to my mind very recently. I was out, my youngest is just turned 4, and she's playing T-ball for the first time, and we live in this like really quaint, very idyllic rural part of Vermont. And I was watching her out there, and it's like there's all these dads that have to help, right? Because if the pre-K crew is gonna play T-ball, it's gonna take like 5 dads are out there with them. And they're rolling them grounders, and they're, helping them actually hit the tee, and they're cheerleading for them, and they're just building up their confidence in so many ways. And I felt so keenly aware in that moment how me and my child were just being held in community so beautifully by other people.
Mm.
And, that's what I want for Emilee, and for her family, and for her mother. I want Emilee to have that second chance so badly. I think she's so deserving of it. And she's so remorseful, and, she's the least pushy in these regards. Like, I'm probably more eager for that even than her family would ask to be. But I just feel that she's so deserving and worthy, and same for her family. And just wanting them to be held in community in that way, is what I really want for them.
What would you say to the people who say, that this is unfathomable to me, that this person must be evil, that there's no way a good person could do something this bad? What direction would you point them in?
And I think if you just look more in depth, in the book, I just sort of take the reader really into the longer story and into those depths of details. And, I do something that really hasn't been included in the literature previously, which is like, I basically make the reader go into the bathroom with Emilee and sit through what that experience is really like. And part of me feels like that this is just an infliction on the reader, and unbearable and intolerable in so many ways. But I think if you really just look at the bare medical realities, um, you can't have that same impression. You can't take the same satisfaction and punishment. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes I think we need to look reality in the eyes. Not 24/7, not all the time, but if we don't, you know, I think people have the right to their judgments, but they also need to recognize that their judgments can contribute to the civic conversation, to the public discourse, which also contributes to the way that we as a society react, whether legally, medically, or whatever to whatever topic. I always think of this great example from psychology, you know, which is, the reason why they dropped sadistic personality out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is they didn't want people, and this is a misconception, right? That you could use it as a defense. They didn't want people to use it as a defense. And it's ridiculous because no personality disorder is an accepted insanity defense. So what happened because of that sort of like hyper reactive response in the legal system, response by society, is we stopped studying it. And so when we stop studying it, we stop funding it because it's no longer in the manual. There's no taxonomy for it. We stop working on preventing it. And I think that while people have the right to their judgments on this, I just think they should be careful in the public conversation to the point that you just made. Go beneath the surface before you start doing things that influence the public conversation about these cases. Because I think people have a hard time seeing that they actually do have, on an individual level, impact. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And I think, yeah, this plays out, like changing that public perception could be so valuable in so many ways in terms of changing the legal outcomes. Um, and what we see in the absence of that is just a huge amount of inconsistency and really prosecutorial discretion in these cases that makes the sentencing really incoherent. And, there's like a quieter form of leniency in a lot of cases, but then you see these really harsh convictions that single people out. Um,
Do you think that's because of the amount of media attention that it gets? That the people where the case gets more media attention, they're more likely to get harsher sentences?
it would be really hard or impossible to quantify that,
Mhm.
but that certainly feels accurate.
Yep.
Yes. And the other thing is that, there's like a political dimension to that too, right? In terms of lumping things together, these tragedies often get described as something like afterbirth abortion. That language implies so much conscious intent, like
Yeah.
evil and malice, like someone would choose to wait and conceal and then pre-plan to do this, which is, a charge of aggravated murder includes those kinds of accusations. Like you're saying that there's intention and malice.
Knowingly, intentionally. Yep.
Well,
Yep.
even just acknowledging like a reckless element, which I think would be a key distinction there. Like, okay, maybe this happens recklessly, but to say that it's like, that just puts so much evil in the mix that I just don't see when you look carefully at the real evidence or go past just the sensational headlines. I just don't see that.
It's interesting to me because one of the things that stuck out to me in researching the case was that there were a ton of sensational headlines, very few substantive stories. I think I saw one really deep story that looked at the topic of denial and drew connections between the type of denial in Emilee's case and the type of sort of like self-deception that we all do, like our ability to repress things. And that kind of took me aback. Like it was weirdly overcovered with sensation and undercovered with nuance. Is that a fair description of that?
It is. And like you see that one better story. I think you're referring to the Elle article by really talented journalist Alex Ronan. And again, that happens after the conviction and after Rachel's already involved and sort of thinking in terms of media strategy. And yeah, I mean, look, if you go all the way back to that colonial era that I was talking about, and these cases were blockbusters, people would travel huge distances to watch girls as young as 12 publicly hanged. And you would see these Puritan preachers very prominent, give sermons at the time. And they were basically making the same points, or characterizing the women in the same way that we see tabloid headlines doing today. And the narrative is that static across American history.
That's frightening. It's frightening that the conversation hasn't changed. So I do appreciate this entire conversation because of its depth and its nuance and its willingness to, I mentioned to you that like there are a lot of people like things very simple. And I hope that is the gateway drug to being able to look at things in a more complex fashion, or at least I pray that it is. The last question I wanted to ask you, what are your hopes and your dreams for the public conversation about things like this?
Twofold. I would love to see better policies emerge that do more to protect babies, that do more to push back against the kinds of like abuse-related infant homicides that we were talking about. I would, love to see more policy and prevention focused on infant mortality and access to more equitable healthcare in that regard. And then in terms of the representation of these rare neonaticide cases, one, just to really remember the humanity and to have the compassion. And you see tons of reporting before the trial or without any real investigative legwork. And I would love to just see more curiosity about the why and to really look at these as individual human stories as opposed to just sort of lumping them all into one category or one stereotype.
Well said, my friend. And I couldn't agree with you more. It was truly, your book, American Infanticide. It was really, really, really fascinating and interesting. And, I'll do my confession here. I remember, being so excited about doing or having this conversation. And I remember when I got the advanced copy, I thought to myself, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? Do I really want to read this? And I am so grateful now coming out on the other end of the book that I did, because I think it leaves me more informed. It leaves me more prepared to be supportive of women in my life. And I think it puts me in a position to better affect the narrative around things like this. So I really am, on a personal level, grateful for you doing this book.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that so much, and so appreciative to Brian for making this connection so that we really could, get in depth and have this really difficult conversation. And I will just confess that there was a part of me that thought when I had the Rutgers send you the advanced copy, I was like, oh gosh, he's gonna read it and he's gonna disinvite me. I really thought that was a possibility.
I mean, it's always a possibility,
Right?
but right, in this case, it wasn't.
This is just not going to go over well. Again, like the infliction on your listeners of the conversation.
No, I mean,
But your listeners are more prepared than many for this kind of nuance.
conversation. Yeah, like I told you, it was something that I didn't normally see. I will normally see a very powerful true crime narrative, or I will see a very sort of like academic researched book that studies a topic, and you are able to really beautifully combine both of them and also bring us something that we haven't had on this case, which is really a deeper conversation with the person who actually went through this experience. And so, I'm really glad that the connection was made. I'm very glad that we're having this conversation. I'm very glad that the book is out there. And, I hope you're able to take the message very broadly, and that we're able as a society to have a much deeper and more nuanced conversation about these things.
Goodness, thank you for saying that. I appreciate your help in that regard so much.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for having you on. So, onward. Thanks for joining Clara and I for this conversation. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again in a few days.